get going. Luke, please say a few words of introduction.
Okay, I assume that more people will join us, but I'll start. I thought one of the things I wanted to say was welcome, and I know the format is different. It's a different thing from how we're doing our Sunday meetings. I know Alan, you were really happy for us to meet, so we could have face-to-face contact. Usually there's a time for us to get to check in with each other, how we doing, what's happening. You know, I missed that from the last Zoom meeting, and it's not possible in the same kind of way. So I thought, and also I didn't get to hear some people's voices at the last meeting. Some people didn't speak, didn't say anything. They were there and they listened, and that's fine. But, you know, we're accustomed to almost everybody participating in meetings. And certainly after meetings, sometimes we have a drink and a chat, so we get a little bit more time to fraternize and thing. And there's Francisco. Welcome, Francisco. Good, you raised your hand.
Hi.
He is an expert at this. You know how it works. And so I thought it would be good to give people a chance just to say hi. How are you doing? Some news I'll share, and that is that, you know, we lost 2 members. Some people heard at the last meeting that Sam Glean died, unfortunately, with the coronavirus. And under not nice circumstances, because he actually was in hospital and they discharged him to a care home, you know, which is like the slaughterhouse as far as I can see for elderly people who've got a virus. So he died in a care home with the virus. And then sadly afterwards, we heard about Ed Spring, who's a longtime member for CLS. And he actually held CLS together for a number of years when activities had lulled significantly. And so, you know, I always salute him for that. And he held things together, and then he asked for me to, you know, maybe take some little bit more responsibility in keeping the organization going. And for those who don't know, we've been around for 41 years now.
Wow.
And one of the things that we had thought about doing was to hold a conference for our 40th birthday in the Caribbean. And we did speak with some people in the Caribbean. We went to Barbados. We met with some of the union leaders there, so on, and had chats about what might be a good issue to make a meeting. I also met with George Lamming, and he felt that federation was still an issue. And for me, I think it's, you know, one of the things we need to discuss and, you know, maybe put on the table again and look at it some more. So I'm just throwing that out at the moment. That's one of the things we plan to do for 40th birthday. We could still possibly think of a conference sometime in the Caribbean, because, you know, that's where our heart is and that's where we want to connect with and see that the changes happen. It's great that, David, you're connected with us because you're rooted in the Caribbean, although you've been here to speak to us about reparations. So we know you're quite an expert on the reparations movement. Is a key issue for us in Caribbean Labor Solidarity. That's why we were invited to Venezuela for that conference on Afro-Descendants, the first one, international conference. A big up as well to Francisco, who has been a stalwart with us from the time he's been connected. And, you know, we can always depend on you to come and inform us about what's happening, not only in Venezuela, but in the entire region. And we salute you for that. And of course, all the members. Paul, you haven't been around for a while. We haven't seen you. Have you given up on London?
No,
No, I've been.
there
okay.
at Christmas, very briefly. I was there briefly at Christmas, seeing our son.
Christmas time you pop in, okay. But it's great, and I hope more people will join us. I see Paula is there. Can't hear her yet. But yeah, so we'll just to really update people on what's happening. Right in London right now, last night we know there was big demonstrations around the Black Lives Matter. Thousands of people turned out. I think today they're going to be at the American Embassy. The government is trying to discourage people because of the virus. But people are making up their minds about that and going out. I probably would have been on those demonstrations myself, but I'm actually caring for an elderly woman, a friend around the corner. So I can't take a risk with getting the virus. But I think it's, you know, something that we all support. It's ridiculous the way in which the Americans have been killing black people. The police have been killing black men, especially at an enormous rate. And this recent George Floyd has really brought it to the attention of the whole world. And we see what's kicking off in Australia, in Singapore, in France, in Spain, you name it, a lot of capitals. And it's great that people are showing, standing up and giving solidarity to black people and the oppression that they're facing, especially in America and in England here itself. So we know that this is happening. So I just wanted to mention that. Oh, there's Nadine.
Hi, Luke.
Nadine has joined us. Where's Cody? I don't see him.
No, he's not here at the moment.
He's not here. Okay. Is he going to join us later?
I don't think so, not today.
Okay. Give him my regards.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we're just warming up before we bring in David to make some opening, to start this discussion going. David, as you mentioned earlier on, we usually, a speaker will speak and then people will ask questions. So we follow that format. And
Okay, so
yes, and here's Frank. Good. More people are joining us. Dennis has got fed up on his left. Frank Murray is here. Frank Murray has joined us.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'll stop there and I'll just say a big welcome to David. It's always been our dream to connect the Caribbean directly with what we're doing, and this virus has given us that opportunity to do it, and it's something we're really pleased about. And you're the first speaker from the Caribbean on this format, so thank you for agreeing to speak and big welcome.
Thank you.
I'll take the floor now.
right, thank you. The floor is yours, David. Please.
Okay, well, good morning, and thank you very much for this invitation. I know that you comrades have been engaged in solidarity with the Caribbean for a very long time, and I know that you come with a whole background of information. So I don't want to necessarily go over things that you already know. Just to give you a little bit about my own background, I have been involved in political activism for a very long time. I'm a lawyer by training, a kind of people's lawyer, Pan-Africanist. But 2 years ago, I responded positively to an offer made by the new Prime Minister of Barbados, Prime Minister Mia Motley. We had a change of government in Barbados 2 years ago. Her party, the Barbados Labour Party, was swept into power. They won all the seats in the parliament. And she asked me if I would serve as Barbados's ambassador to CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, and to the Association of Caribbean States. So I have been serving in that capacity over the past 2 years. It has therefore given me some insights into CARICOM, its strengths and its weaknesses. The first thing I would say is that we Caribbean people have a very unfortunate tendency to be very critical about ourselves, and sometimes to discount our positive achievements. So there is a general tendency within the Caribbean to be very critical about CARICOM, this Caribbean community, our Caribbean integration movement. As we know, this movement came about as a result, the CARICOM initiative specifically came about as a result of the collapse of the Federation, that whole experiment in political unification. And after the collapse of the Federation, there were some enlightened leaders who understood that they had to incrementally build back that sense of Caribbean integration and unity. And so they started with CARIFTA in 1968, the Caribbean Free Trade Area, and that evolved by 1973 into the Caribbean Community. So we went from just the simplest level of integration, a free trade area, and we evolved into a common market with a common external tariff. We evolved into a system of functional cooperation, where we looked at the areas that we needed to do collectively, and we now have some 18 CARICOM institutions that cover a whole range of functional areas, from education to trade to agricultural development, you name it. We have 7 associate institutions of the Caribbean community. These institutions like the University of the West Indies, for example. And then we have a few institutions that are involved in a functional cooperation relationship with CARICOM. In addition, we decided that we would make an effort to coordinate our foreign policies, try for collective foreign policy. And as the years went on, the integration got deeper and deeper, and we now have the CARICOM single market and single economy. We're still working on the single economy part of it. It's still a work in progress. But the point I want to make is that this regional integration enterprise is now over 50 years old. If we go back, if we see its genesis as the launching of CARIFTA in 1968, so we are now 52 years old. It has survived, it is here, it has gone through its ups and downs, but it is still here, and it is playing a critical role for our people. It is by no means perfect. There are many deficiencies, but we have done relatively well in putting an infrastructure in place, and you know, Doug spoke about putting federation back on the agenda. Well, what I can say is that being in CARICOM for the last 2 years, I have not heard any serious interest in restarting a federation. The emphasis tends to be on how do we perfect the regional integration mechanisms that we currently have under the CARICOM arrangement, and how do we make them more meaningful. Now, we can see the value of CARICOM if we look at this COVID-19 challenge. You would note that it is being said that the region of the world that has seemingly best handled the COVID-19 challenge is the Caribbean region. And you know, we have done very well. For example, in Barbados, no one with COVID-19, no one who has tested positive with COVID-19 would be permitted to remain in their home. For example, what happened in the UK with Boris Johnson could not happen in Barbados. Anyone testing positive for COVID-19 is immediately taken to a proper hospital, an isolation center, and given the best medical treatment that the country has, free of cost, given treatment by specialist doctors and nurses. And incidentally, we have a team of 100 specialist Cuban nurses in Barbados, specifically to help man the COVID-19 centers that we have established. In fact, Barbados actually, many people give great kudos to the Chinese government for building a COVID-19 hospital in 10 days. Well, I can tell you that Barbados achieved a similar feat. We built a 220 bed hospital in the northern tip of the island in 30 days, specifically to manage COVID-19 patients. So what we have done, we have totally separated COVID-19 patients from the general health system. We have constructed a new hospital and converted other facilities that are exclusively for COVID-19 patients. But how did we reach to that level of organization? Well, we reached to that level of organization because we have a CARICOM institution who has a mandate to look after the public health of the region. That's the Caribbean Public Health Agency. That institution is headquartered in Trinidad and Tobago. So from the time we got word of this virus in China, you know, we came together under the guidance of the Caribbean Public Health Agency, our Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, which is located in Barbados. And we utilized the CARICOM structure, the Council for Human and Social Development, that brings together all of the ministers of health and the chief medical officers from the various CARICOM member states. So we came together under the Council for Social and Human Development in partnership with our Caribbean Public Health Agency, the Pan American Health Organization, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and we put in place region-wide plans for dealing with COVID. So that is testimony to the effectiveness of CARICOM. But I also have to say that we have to be very, very apprehensive about what our immediate future will be, because we have handled the public health crisis very well, but COVID-19 has inflicted upon us a very, very severe economic and social challenge. As you would be aware, most of the Caribbean island states depend on tourism. In fact, we depend too much on tourism, and the tourism industries have been wiped out. So through no fault of our own, we now find ourselves in a very, very serious existential crisis. And that has implications for CARICOM, because you know, we have this very comprehensive structure, but that comprehensive structure calls for resources. Member states have to pay annual dues to CARICOM. Member states have to finance the 18 CARICOM institutions and the 7 associate institutions of CARICOM. And in a situation now of economic crisis, when there have been massive retrenchment of workers, many people thrown into unemployment, a massive decline in government revenues, the question will be, can we continue to finance and support this structure? So this is a very, very difficult period for us. Some countries, I would say Barbados is very fortunate. We are very fortunate we had that change of government 2 years ago, because a very, very dynamic Prime Minister has taken over leadership in Barbados. The first female Prime Minister in our history, but extremely dynamic. And she has made a tremendous difference. And even in terms of her response to the economic challenge posed by COVID-19, she has been extremely proactive and has come up with a very dynamic homegrown program to take Barbados through this crisis and to restructure our economy. But every country isn't necessarily blessed with the same kind of forward-thinking, dynamic leadership. And I think that one of the weaknesses of CARICOM, for me, perhaps the major weakness is that although all of these structures are in place, all of these ministerial councils are in place, yet we seem not to have been able to get these structures to function really meaningfully in terms of development planning. So we come together, we do quite well on issues pertaining to trade and how do we remove trade restrictions and so forth, policy issues. But in terms of developing really meaningful mechanisms to carry out development planning, to work together to actually build new regional industries, to get the planning, the economic planning across our 15 territories so deep and so meaningful that, for example, in dealing with this economic challenge, that we actually come together and truly pull together all our resources and build new production capacity in our region. I think that is a challenge. We are still lacking in that area. Granted that we have brought together, as a response to COVID-19, an agriculture and food task force that is coming up with a plan to respond to the economic challenge by intensifying cooperation in developing our food production capacity. But I'm still not convinced that we are as good as we need to be in that area. Now, we also we try to coordinate our foreign policy. This is an area that sometimes we struggle with. There are governments of various political persuasions. We would like to think that in CARICOM, we would have a very strong, independent foreign policy, that we would stand for something in the world, that we would be anti-imperialists. We would see ourselves as a champion and defender of developing countries against imperialist depredations. But as I said, sometimes it depends on what particular government, what persuasion that government may be that comes to power. So let me just jump into something here that where I think an organization like Caribbean Labor Solidarity can be of assistance to us in the Caribbean. I've just come back from Suriname. I was part of a CARICOM electoral observer mission in Suriname. Suriname just had a general election, and CARICOM sent a mission to observe the general election. Prior to the election, the government in power was led by the National Democratic Party, the party of President Desi Bouterse. And Suriname under President Bouterse, strong member of CARICOM, very committed to the Caribbean integration movement, very principled in its foreign policy positions, very anti-imperialist. But as a result of the election, Bouterse's party has lost its majority in the National Assembly. So the likelihood is that Bouterse will be replaced as president of Suriname, and we will have a new government. And the question will be, will that new government be similarly anti-imperialist, similarly committed to the Caribbean integration movement? We'll have to wait and see, but suffice to say that the party that is now the majority party is one that is very much oriented more towards Holland, you know, the former colonial master. Now, why did President Bouta's party lose the election? Well, there were a number of scandals that had emerged over the last, I guess, year or so. And I'm seeing a role for organizations like yours to continue to keep a very close eye on the Caribbean. And I would imagine that Caribbean Labor Solidarity, that you will have an interest in ensuring that, in helping, giving support to labor-oriented, anti-imperialist political parties and governments to do well, to take power, to remain in power in the Caribbean. And it occurred to me that, you know, we had a strong anti-imperialist government in place in Suriname. Obviously, some things went wrong, and there were clear signs that some things had gone wrong. But who was there to point this out to them, to say to them, hey, there's some things that you're going off track. There's some things you need to correct. Otherwise, you're in danger of losing the support of the people and losing the government ultimately. The point I'm making is it would help us immensely in CARICOM, certainly in terms of how we craft and deploy a collective foreign policy, a progressive collective foreign policy. If we had the right administrations in place, the right political parties in place. And I'm saying that a role that you can play, because this is, as I understand it, this has been your traditional role. You were set up as a solidarity organization to pay attention to the labor struggle in the Caribbean, to give solidarity and to give support. And I'm saying that that need still exists, and still exists not only in relation to trade unions, but in relation to political parties that, in your opinion, have the right labor-oriented, socialist-oriented, anti-imperialist policies and thinking. And we have, over the past 2 years, we in CARICOM have tried to play a very constructive role, for example, in relation to the crisis in Venezuela. We have tried to stand up for the Caribbean being a zone of peace, for there to be no imperialist intervention in Venezuela, that the Venezuelan problem has to be sorted out by the Venezuelan people themselves, that we must apply all of the fundamental principles of international law, the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. So we have tried to stand for that. But it has not always been easy, because you have some administrations that are very strong in terms of their national sovereignty, but then you have others that are more pulled into an imperialist camp and so forth. So the point I'm making is, it is in all of our interests to be aware, to keep on top of developments in the Caribbean, to understand which political parties, which administrations we would wish to support, to give solidarity to see in office in their respective territories, and to be a critical voice, because sometimes it is that objective voice from afar that is able to say to a political party or an administration, look, you're going off track. You're doing some wrong things here. You need to correct this before you lose the confidence of the people. So Let me end on that note. I'm seeing that as a role that an organization like yours can continue to play, and perhaps even expand. And that could be very, very helpful to us in the Caribbean region. So, but let me end here and open up to some questions and some dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, David. That was very interesting. Yes, a round of probably silent applause. I have now seen two hands have gone up to speak. Just to explain to those who joined us later, I've muted more or less everybody so that we don't get interrupting each other inadvertently. Can I ask if someone wants to speak? You'll see on the bottom of your screen something that says participants. If you click on that, you'll then see the option to raise your hand. And I then get a little blue hand on my screen and I know you wish to speak. So if we could do it that way, because there's more of us now that fill the screen. So anyone who waves their hand might be waving to the other screen and no one be seen. So I've got Luke and I've got Dennis who want to say something. So I'll take those two first, and then so we take Luke and Dennis, and then David can respond to them, and then we'll see who else wants to say something. So Luke, please.
Yes. Thanks very much for that, David. The short notice to speak at length on CARICOM. It wasn't my intention to drag you into that discussion because I think people were looking forward to looking at the topic that we advertised, which was to look at the zone of peace. And I didn't want you to be speaking for an hour long. So I was trying to interrupt early on, but everything you said was very informative and also is crucial for the work that we do. And yes, you know, we're an anti-imperialist organization mainly, and we look to support the left and the parties of the left in the region. So everything you said confirmed the things that we do. So thank you for that. But I wanted to save you a little bit for the main topic, which I know most people have keyed in for here today, which is about the Caribbean being a zone of peace. Do I have a question? I think about the CARICOM. I think, yes, you know, there's things about the CARICOM, of course, that it being separate governments, as it were, and having that voting right at the UN does enhance us as a bloc if we can move together as a bloc and put the vote where it is. If it's a federation, I guess it will be maybe one vote they might have, which will disadvantage us in some ways. But I think in dealing with some of the very deep economic and political questions coming up in the future, whether a united bloc would not do. But I don't want to draw you into a discussion too much on CARICOM, because I think it's on the federation issue at the moment, because something I think we need to deal with fully at some point. But for now, I think, yes, that's all I wanted to say. So we can get back to looking at the zone of peace in the next session.
Thank you. Dennis?
Yes, David, welcome. Thank you very much for a very informative speech. And I actually wanted a very, very quick description from you of the difference between federation and CARICOM. Not too long, but I know very little about the nexus of federation. And it would be interesting to know the difference and the similarities.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me apologize for not recognizing that you'd wanted me to address zone of peace specifically. I probably didn't pay sufficient attention to the text that was sent to me. I just thought CARICOM. But anyhow, we can get deeply into discussion about the idea of the zone of peace. In relation to the question, though, well, federation was a political union where you were coming together to form one nation, one multi-territory federated nation. So it was a political union. The Caribbean Community CARICOM is not a political union. It is an integration mechanism. So each territory still has its own separate sovereignty and identity as a nation state, as its own vote at the United Nations and the Organization of American States, for example. But what we have done with CARICOM is to come together, to pool our resources, to work together, to engage in functional cooperation, to set up common institutions to help us deal with whether it's education, healthcare, agricultural production, whatever. And very importantly, to make an effort to coordinate our foreign policies, to see if we could, although we are not one nation with one Ministry of Foreign Affairs and one foreign policy, but to see how we could come together to collaborate to achieve a collective foreign policy. And of course, as we have deepened the integration and cooperation exercise, we have gone as far as trying to establish a single market and single economy. We are now trying to make of these 15 territories and the whole space, the whole geographical space, we're trying to treat it as one domestic space, where in terms of movement of people, movement of goods, movement of capital, etc., etc. So this is the idea. So deep cooperation and integration that just stops short of collapsing all of our sovereignties into one political union. This, and you know, the point that Luke is making is that the CARICOM countries, we are very strong, for example, in the Organization of American States, because we control a block of 14 votes. One of our members is a British dependency, Montserrat, so they don't have a vote. But the other member states of CARICOM are all independent nation states. So we are forced to reckon with, in, for example, the Organization of American States, we control 14 of the 35 votes. And because of that power, we have been able, on several occasions in the OAS, to forestall efforts that were being made by the big powers, the United States and Canada and so forth, to really put Venezuela under the gun. We have been able to ensure either that a resolution wasn't passed, or it wasn't passed with sufficient 2/3 majority, you know, to put in train some very negative consequences for Venezuela as an example. So that's a source of power. But if we do want to get into that discussion about the idea of the zone of peace, we can. Just I'll just be guided by you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that would at some stage, if you could say a little more about the concept, because I must say it's new to me. It sounds exciting and good, if you see what I mean. But something a little more sort of expressing the idea could be quite useful. But before then, Frank, did you want to say something? Your hand's kind of gone up and down.
Yes. Yes, it's just so that you know I'm there to say something. I mean, this question might lead Dave onto the zone of peace. So thank you, David. You know, it's always nice to listen to what you've got to say. It's always interesting. What I want to ask is that with the rampant electioneering that's going on in America, and you know that it's always a vote winner for America to go to war. Now, they have been threatening Venezuela for the longest while. What are the chances of the CARICOM losing its unity and, well, say the other forces within Caribbean, supporting America in their drive to go and invade Venezuela?
All right, so that takes me right into the whole issue of the zone of peace. Just to give the quick background about the zone of peace, This concept, a lot of credit has to be given to the late Prime Minister Maurice Bishop of Grenada, because soon after the Grenada Revolution, Prime Minister Maurice Bishop piloted a resolution in the Organization of American States, declaring the Caribbean region a zone of peace. And that resolution cohered with a United Nations. The United Nations actually passed a resolution initiating this international law concept of zones of peace. And the United Nations resolution said that different regions of the world would have to undertake responsibility. That it was a general concept, but it was now left up to different regions of the world to give specific content to what would be the elements of their regional zone of peace. So the concept within the Caribbean was driven initially by Prime Minister, like Grenada, Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. And over the years, it gained greater currency. The Caribbean Conference of Churches endorsed it. Different political leaders within the Caribbean endorsed it. The concept has been endorsed by the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. And so, yes, and so we have tried to give it, concrete content. And of course, that concrete content is based on the fundamental principles of international law, principles of non-intervention, respect for national sovereignty, peaceful settlement of disputes, etc., etc. So we can say that the concept of a zone of peace is an international law concept. Of course, you know how international law is developed. It's always an incremental process. You have to fight for it. You have to build its legitimacy and credibility. But we have found it, we in the Caribbean have found it to be a very useful concept to use as a shield as we approach powerful countries that wish to come into the Caribbean to do things that are guaranteed to disrupt the peace of our region. So this whole thing came to a head in January of last year, January of 2019, when Mr. Juan Guaido declared himself president of Venezuela, and he was immediately recognized as such by the United States of America and by various European countries, and I think the European Union and so forth. And it was clear that this was well coordinated, this was planned. So immediately this happened. Immediately, we in the Caribbean, we recognized the danger, because having established this alternative to the legitimate government of Venezuela, the administration of President Maduro, and then seeing these very powerful countries immediately coalesce around Mr. Guaido, we recognized where this was going. This was rapidly heading in the direction of some kind of intervention, perhaps even a military intervention, or at the very least, was heading in the direction of the eruption of some kind of civil war, aggressive shooting civil war in Venezuela. And so the very next day, the CARICOM heads of government called an emergency meeting, an emergency heads of government meeting. The highest institution of CARICOM is the Conference of Heads of Government. That's the highest policy-making, decision-making body. So immediately, the very next day, through video conferencing, an emergency heads of government meeting was held. It was agreed at that meeting that we would not be endorsing this idea of Guaido being any president of Venezuela. That we recognize the danger of this thing sliding into a military conflict. And we decided to put together a team of prime ministers, a 3-person team. Prime Minister Mia Mottley, Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley of Trinidad and Tobago, and the then chairman of CARICOM, Prime Minister Dr. Timothy Harris of St. Kitts. And we immediately sent them on a mission to the United Nations to speak to the Secretary General. And even before they left on that mission, we drew up a statement calling on all parties to take a step back, insisting that there must be no intervention, no outside intervention in Venezuela, that whatever dispute existed in Venezuela must be settled through dialogue and peaceful means. And we immediately sent our ambassadors at the United Nations to a special hearing of the Security Council to put those CARICOM positions on the table. By the weekend, our trio of prime ministers had reached the United Nations, and by the Monday, we're having meetings with the Secretary General and with other representatives of Canada and other major countries and so forth. So CARICOM intervened very decisively. And were it not for the CARICOM intervention, I believe that a momentum would have been set in train that would probably have led to some kind of military intervention in Suriname. The CARICOM ended up in something. We were then joined by Mexico and Uruguay. Are you all hearing me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. We were then joined by Mexico and Uruguay in something called the Montevideo Mechanism, where we said to the two contending parties in Venezuela, look, we will broker peaceful dialogue, peaceful talks aimed at coming to a peaceful resolution, but we are not countenancing any outside intervention. And the concept that we came back to time and time again is this concept that the Caribbean must be a zone of peace, and that were there to be any outside intervention in Venezuela's affairs, it would have very negative effects for our entire region. And therefore, our number one objective was to maintain the Caribbean as a zone of peace. So the concept has proved to be very, very helpful. Barbados, we actually hosted 2 rounds of talks in Barbados between the Maduro administration and the Guaido forces. Norway, as you may know, Norway was overseeing a process of dialogue, and Norway asked Barbados to host 2 sets of talks. So far so good. Now the question was asked: how can we keep our CARICOM unity on this very divisive issue? That first meeting, that emergency meeting that was held right after Guaido declared himself president. I was at that meeting, and what happened at that meeting is that when heads of government are forced to come into a room, even virtually, to speak to their peers, to be confronted with positions of principle, to be confronted by persons who say, but this is what the United Nations Charter says. These are the fundamental principles of international law. It becomes difficult for them simply to run off with some unprincipled position. So I find that when we invest in talking, in coming together, in having meetings, in actually talking through and thrashing out difficult issues, that we do find that we may not get the best or most progressive position, find that we are able to come to some kind of common ground that tends to be acceptable. But so on that occasion, although we didn't all come into the meeting with the same positions, we were able to work out, because you had certain governments in CARICOM that had taken public positions, refusing to accept the legitimacy of the Maduro administration. Others had accepted it as a legitimate administration. So we had that difference. But in having the discussion, everybody was able to come to a position that if any one of us was to recognize this claim that Guaido was making, that he was now the president, that would lead inevitably to some kind of very serious conflict within Venezuela that would have negative consequences for our region. So no one was prepared to go that far. So when we invest in this kind of dialogue, we can more come to sensible positions. But we do have a situation where a number of the member states of CARICOM have been drawn into a kind of American-dominated orb. For example, I mean, it's no secret that the administration in Haiti, for example, under a lot of pressure from the Haitian people, to a large extent being kept in power by support from the American administration, and therefore find it very difficult to adopt any positions independent of the American policy. Then there are one or two member states that ideologically are more to the right and are more supportive of kind of right-wing thinking that comes out of CARICOM, that comes out of the United States, of Washington. And sometimes we have to grapple with those member states and their positions. And that's why sometimes you may not get the outright progressive position that several of our member states want to take, because we always find that we have to engage in some kind of compromise. In order to keep a consensus, we have to compromise the more progressive positions and come to some kind of middle ground. But so far, whenever we have been able to come to middle ground, the middle ground tends to have been fairly positive and fairly helpful. But it is a struggle, because and that's why I began by speaking about Suriname, because we might just have lost a very strong member of the progressive anti-imperialist group of member states within CARICOM with the recent election in Suriname. And so that's the point I was making, that if we have a vested interest in ensuring that strong, principled, anti-imperialist administrations remain in place, then when we see something happening in the domestic politics of that country, that may lead to an erosion of popular confidence and electoral support. It would be so great if there was some organization paying attention and being able to make contact with that administration and to say, look, we recognize that there's some danger signs here. Pull this back. We don't want to lose you. And give that solidarity and critical and constructive support. So where are we now? It is what? 1.5 years now since Guaido declared himself president, and there's been some kind of a stalemate, although the United States, the Trump administration, continues to impose the sanctions on Venezuela, continues to tighten these sanctions. CARICOM has taken a principled position particularly in relation to COVID-19, calling for making the case that to impose sanctions when the country is facing a humanitarian crisis is not on, and calling for the removal of those sanctions. So we are there. Our position remains the same. Caribbean must be a zone of peace. No outside illegal intervention in Venezuela. We offer our offices, our good offices, to facilitate a process of dialogue and negotiation. But there are some of our member states that can be pulled away for one reason or the other to break that CARICOM consensus. So that remains a concern.
Thank you very much. Tutiette, did I see your hand up?
Yes, yes. When Luke mentioned, hi everyone, sorry for arriving late. When Luke mentioned the UN, I came across that there is a group in the UN for indigenous people, and I feel that we can strengthen our allyship by identifying with that group. I'm just going to bring it up now and I'll put it in the chat. Yes, the indigenous get a lot more sympathy than Africans. So, and somehow, if you're from the continent, you're not indigenous. But this group in the UN dispels that, that myth. And there's someone, a leader from Ecuador, that has the ear of Bill Gates. So just so that we can identify where our allies are, so that we can get this thing done quickly, because I'm tired.
Well,
right. Thank you very much, David. And can I say, can I ask you to answer that and to sum up a little, and then I think we'll move on, if we may.
Yeah, I take the point. CARICOM, we have a CARICOM reparations campaign. We launched a campaign for reparations in 2013. And our campaign is for reparations both for the genocide people of the Caribbean and for the enslavement of African people. Around the concept of reparations, we have a common cause with the indigenous people of our hemisphere. Recently, when President Evo Morales of Bolivia was illegally forced out of office, and a regime of terror was inflicted on the indigenous people of Bolivia, CARICOM really shunned, because we passed a resolution that we took to the Organization of American States, condemning the violence against the indigenous people of Bolivia, and condemning, the centuries of racism, really, that has been imposed on the indigenous people of our region. So it is not difficult for us in CARICOM to understand that there's a connection between us and the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. But I take your point that there's much more we can do in building those alliances. You said the United Nations, but you need to be aware that in our region, we also have, in addition to CARICOM, we have other mechanisms of hemispheric integration. We have, for example, the Association of Caribbean States, which was actually the brainchild of CARICOM, but it is the CARICOM member states plus the countries of Central America, including Mexico, and the countries of Northern South America. Then we also have the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is an even wider hemispheric grouping. In fact, it's the entire hemisphere with the exception of Canada and United States. And that was the style of Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro. But it is not as effective as it was when Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez were around. Back then, all across the Americas, we had progressive administrations in place. But since then, there's been a rolling back of those progressive gains. So the community of Latin American and Caribbean states is somewhat a divided organization today because of that. But yes, I take the point that all of the oppressed people of the Western Hemisphere, the African people, the indigenous people, give solidarity to each other.
I suggest that we go further, because this is a global pandemic. Everybody, the planet is being affected, and so we shouldn't limit ourselves to the Western Hemisphere. The indigenous, it's First Nations people across the globe have solutions to the pandemic, but they're not being consulted with for solutions. So Afro Hirsch did a piece, why excesses on coronavirus being ignored. She did that in The Guardian. And on Channel News tomorrow, Lindsay Hilson is doing a piece on how indigenous medicine in Brazil is having a lot of success as well. So I haven't seen it yet because it's not been broadcast, but Nations people have the answers for this pandemic. And so we shouldn't limit ourselves, this group, to just looking at the Western Hemisphere.
Well, the Western Hemisphere.
And your countryman, Buddy Laria, he has made alliances with, so want to have a fist, you know, don't want to like this.
I'm sorry, Tutiette, we're losing you. Your connection's going down, I'm afraid. But thank you very much. I think your point is well made, that basically the oppressed people of the world need to unite on a whole range of issues, including this one. Right. Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Thank you for those who've made a contribution, and thank you for the discipline of those who haven't. And thank you very much, David, for your very interesting contribution. We mentioned at the, anyway, a small round of applause for David and even though I've muted everybody so you can't actually hear them, rest assured that that it's there. Can I? Luke mentioned at the beginning that our comrade Ed Spring has passed away, and Frank Murray was particularly close to Ed. So, Frank, would you like to say a couple of words in honour of our comrade Ed? Or you can do if I unmute you anyway.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Ed was one of these people who was always there for you. You know, he was one of the people who, in fact, he wouldn't want you or wouldn't want anyone to know what sacrifices he was making. I know in the Grenada Revolution, Ed did a lot of work for that. He did most of the printing, etc., right here in Tottenham at TCP. You know, he was one of those comrades that was always a comrade. In fact, up until I met Ed, I was one of the I suppose the people who couldn't stand white people as a whole, you know. But here was somebody who united with me politically, you know, and you know, he really showed me that there are certain people, you know, you just think, well, come the revolution, what could we do to say, you know, Ed was one of the people that, if there was the revolution I was dreaming of, you know, Ed was one of the people we wouldn't know what to do with, because he would have been right there alongside us fighting. You know, he was a communist through and through, and he made no beef or excuses about being a communist. He was a fighter for the workers. Towards the end, he did slow down quite a bit, but you know, he was always present at the CLS meetings whenever he could make it. And he's one of the people that I certainly will miss. You know, I remember, a lot of us know Buzz Johnson. Buzz Johnson, when he started the bookshop, a lot of us don't know the contribution that Ed made towards that bookshop. You know, and to this day, you know, it is a contribution that really touches your heart. You know, Ed was a real workers' fighter, and you know, I think he will surely be missed. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dennis, I see your hand.
Yes, Frank has stolen some of the things I was going to say about Ed. I can't even remember when I got to know Ed, but it was more than 30 years ago. And the contribution he gave to the Grenada Revolution cannot be measured. The contribution also became vitally important after the American invasion, when the Americans were like slave masters in days of yore, trying to execute those uppity Negroes who had the temerity to want to control their own lives. And Ed worked tirelessly with us and with comrades from CLS and comrades from the Committee for Human Rights in Grenada to ensure that material was printed and was distributed. This is in the days before social media, when if you wanted to get your message out, it had to be physically got out. Ed did not complain. Ed, at no time did I get any impression that he saw color. He saw oppression and he wanted to defeat it. In relation to Buzz Johnson and the work that Ed did that enabled Buzz's publishing house, Carrier Press, resulted in more than 50 books on the Caribbean, Africa, and the diaspora to be produced. Ed is a wonderful comrade, well missed, and I hope that we see many more of him. I cannot say much more than that. There's a lot more that I don't know. I only knew part of Ed's life. But the bit that I knew was full. There were so many things he was doing. Ed, we miss you.
Good. Thank you very much. I think that's as a fitting tribute. Right. Finally, I'm going to ask Luke to say something before we close the meeting. Luke, please.
Okay. Maybe the first thing is thanks again, David, for coming on to this meeting, and for everybody else. Francisco, we didn't hear from you, but it's just good seeing some of your faces who've shown, and just seeing the names up there. I know people are around. Paula, I don't know if you're hearing us. I see your name, but not seeing anything else. It's really good that you come out to this meeting. I look forward to when we can get together in body soon, I hope, and meet up. But we will still want to continue some kind of Zoom element of this meeting, because if we can get the likes of David to come along and speak to us, and Paul to be connected in there too, if he's not around, it would be fantastic. I just wanted to say a little bit more about Ed, because, you know, he was just so much. He was an artist, and when I look to my left here in my room, I see a piece of art that he gave me, which is a bit of art about Winnie Mandela, which is just a fantastic piece of work that he presented to me some time ago. I think CLS would have struggled or probably would have folded without the contribution that Ed made shortly after the Grenada Revolution, when most of the left collapsed, disappeared, and there wasn't a lot of activity. Of course, the CLS continued fighting for the release of the 17, and we did a lot of work around that. But there was a time we were down to 3 people meeting when I had missed meetings for maybe 2 years. And when I went back, it was down to 2 or 3 people meeting. And Ed was the person who was holding things together. And he confided in me, you know, that he wasn't too well and he wanted somebody else to maybe take up the reins, which I couldn't refuse the offer. So here we are, CLS. We're going, we're gathering in strength. We need to keep growing. We hear you, Tutiette. We need to broaden out and get other organizations on board. We continue to remain committed to the Caribbean as our main focus, but we know we can't exist in a vacuum down there. So our struggle is wide, of course, in Africa and Latin America, especially in the diaspora, wherever they are, in England. And so we look to see how we can make alliances. We've done a lot of work around Windrush. We need to be reminded, and we still have plans to put on a big meeting. Reparations will continue to be a big issue for us. And Francisco, you're woken up. He's back. I can see Francisco. He's there. Yes, Francisco, we're just wrapping up. I'm sorry we didn't get a contribution from you this time, but maybe our next meeting, the executive will meet and we will decide what would be the next topical issue to look at. I was worried about the warships going down to Venezuela. And maybe you can tell us what's happening with those warships. Are they still hanging around Venezuela's coast? Yeah. Francisco, a minute. Can we give Francisco a minute to maybe tell us what's happening, just briefly, about the Venezuela and the warships and so on?
Because David was so comprehensive in his presentation regarding, you know, the dimensions of CARICOM, Caribbean unity in terms of foreign policy and Venezuela, that I felt there was not much that I could add. Except one thing is, if you equivocate on being very strong regarding that the people of a country are the ones who are supposed to elect their governors and their presidents, if you equivocate on that, then that might be used against you very soon. And the United States is extremely worried about the block 14 votes. And therefore, from that point of view, anybody in that region who equivocates, you know, is going to be under threat and is going to put in jeopardy everybody else. Regarding the threat, it's not clear exactly how many, but there are about possibly 50 war machines, which include helicopters, warships, possibly submarines, warplanes, and then 3 warships from Europe. This is extremely important. One is the Argus from Great Britain that is collaborating with the naval blockade, not only against Venezuela, but against anybody in that region that may want to collaborate with Venezuela, and certainly is designed to threaten Cuba. There's no question about it. There is also a very strong, powerful warship from France, which is called the Dixmude. And then there is another one, I haven't been able to get it, but it's formally been informed that Holland also sent the warships to collaborate with the naval blockade. What is extremely dodgy about it is that all warships are supposed to carry a thing which is called AIM, A-I-M, which is a sort of GPS for warships. Everybody is supposed to know where they are, and they are supposed to leave an electronic trail of wherever they go, because that's, you know, security for everybody. These 3 particular ships has decided to disconnect that system. So you can see that this is extremely worrying. And given that the United States has failed on everything is tried against Venezuela, it's got only one option, which is military action. And the Venezuelans are denouncing that another mercenary, possibly bigger attack is being prepared on Colombian soil with the collaboration and complicity of the Colombian government possibly the Brazilian government, certainly directed by the Americans. This is extremely worrying because if they get away with it, there is no chance for the Caribbean, and the block boats of 14 will disappear in weeks after if they get away with Venezuela. I'll leave it at that for you to understand the significance of the danger that Venezuela faces, even though they will fight and defend themselves to the death. And it's not going to be easy for the United States. Donald Trump is desperate to get something of a victory in foreign policy, and the only one that he has, it seems to be Venezuela. Let's hope that they think twice.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Okay, and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you very much, David. That was very interesting that you could say something. So did I see your hand up? Did you want to say a last word? No.
If I just very quickly, just to say that, I hope you're aware that CARICOM and the African Union have taken an initiative to come together. We were actually supposed to have a CARICOM African Union Heads of Government Summit in Nairobi, Kenya, this month of June, but because of the COVID situation, that wouldn't happen now. And also that the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific countries have just reconfigured the ACP group of countries. What we have said is this ACP group was set up simply as a convenience to negotiate trade agreements with the European Union. But we are going beyond that. We're going to give it a life and an agenda of its own. And that has been an initiative that has come very much from the Caribbean. Just to let you know that there are these very interesting and progressive developments taking place in connection with Africa and also with the Pacific region as well. So that's it. That's it from me. Thanks for inviting me once again. It was a pleasure to contribute to a historic group such as this.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, and thank you all for coming. We will take note of what David said about interventions where we possibly can, and we've always pledged our solidarity with, particularly with Venezuela, but with all countries facing imperialist attacks in the region and elsewhere, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so. So anyway, thank you very much, and I declare the meeting over. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Tutiette.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Now you're getting
I'm a
dressed.
bit late. I came in too late.
Bye-bye.